In this lesson, we are going to use set-driven key to drive the squash and stretch of a ball. We're going to be exploring how a single channel that you create can control multiple channels on an object. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create a polygon primitives sphere. We're going to move that up 1 and translate Y, and then we're going to go to modify and freeze transforms and edit, delete by type history. Let's zoom in there to our ball. Next, we're going to create a NURBS primitive, and we're going to create a circle. And that circle will be built at the origin. We'll make it a little bit bigger. Let's make sure we're showing all of our objects. We're going to turn it 90 degrees in the X. We'll scale it, and then we'll do the same thing, freeze transforms and delete by type history. This is going to be our control, and this is going to be our ball. So we'll call this ball, and we'll call this control. Now on the control, I'm going to create a new attribute. In order to do that, you need to go to the attribute editor. You can select that and go to attributes and add attributes. And when we create the new attribute, we will just call this squash underscore stretch. We're going to set the negative or the minimum value to be -10 and the maximum value to be 10. Go ahead and click OK, and you can see that it adds it in our channel box over here. We'll close the attribute editor. The next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that my ball is set up to squash and stretch. You remember in our previous exercise when we did our ball bounce, we created a new node above the ball to squash and stretch because we want it to squash and stretch from the bottom of the ball. So let's group the ball, Control G. We'll rename this to squash stretch group. And then with that selected, we're going to go into our set-driven key window. So let's go to animation, key, set-driven key, and set. You see that opens up the set-driven key window. We'll go ahead and make sure that we load that in. That's our squash and stretch group is going to be our driven. And then we'll select our control and we'll select our driver. Now the first thing we have to do is we have to set a neutral key. With our squash and stretch attribute is set at 0. We want the scale of the ball to be 1. So let's go ahead and select the squash and stretch channel. And then we're going to hold down Control and select X, Y, and Z on the squash stretch group. Go ahead and key that, and you'll see if I select my squash and stretch group that the channels of the scale are now blue, indicating that they're being driven by a set-driven key. Next, let's go and let's change our squash and stretch to 10. And then remember clicking on these objects in the window selects them. So this is going to be our squash. So positive is going to be our squash and negative is going to be our stretch. Let's go ahead and select our scale Y. We're going to set that to 0.6. And then scale X is going to be 1.6 and scale Z is going to be 1.6 as well. So we're driving all three of these scale channels with the squash and stretch channel. Okay, now that we've completed that, we'll just go ahead and hit key. That's going to create an additional key. And if you select your squash and stretch group and go to your graph editor, you'll see that it creates these curves. These curves indicate the squash and stretch that we are creating on it. These are the channels that are being driven. They are not an animation, but they are using a curve to determine the squash and stretch of the ball. Let's go back to our control, and then let's click on our squash and stretch and just run through it in the window. And you can see that it'll go from neutral to squashed. So now all we need to do is add our stretch. So let's change the value of our squash stretch to -10. We'll select squash and stretch group, and we're going to reverse those values. So our scale Y is going to be 1.6, our scale X is going to be 0.6, and our scale Z is going to be 0.6 as well. Let's go ahead and key that, and you'll see that it adds additional keys. Select our control again, click on squash and stretch, and then we're just going to run through it. And you can see as I translate it from 10 to -10 that it's going to squash and stretch our ball. You can make a quick little animation with that. So let's go to frame 0. We'll just hit S. Frame 8, we'll go ahead and change our squash to, let's just say 6. Then frame 12, we'll change our stretch to, let's say, -5. And then at frame 20, we'll change it back to 0. So now if you run through, you should see the ball is able to squash and stretch, and all we did was animate that one channel. That is set-driven key and how it can be used to control multiple channels on your objects.